Motor oil dripped from Riley Castellano's calloused fingers as three well-dressed men in expensive suits surrounded her repair bay at Davidson's auto shop. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step away from that vehicle immediately," the lead man ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His companions flanked him like bodyguards, their hands instinctively hovering near concealed weapons beneath tailored jackets. Then everything changed in an instant. A fourth figure emerged from behind the black SUV parked outside a distinguished woman in military dress uniform with silver eagles gleaming on her shoulders. Her sharp eyes caught sight of the intricate tattoo partially visible on Riley's shoulder blade, where her coveralls had shifted during her work. The colonel's entire demeanor transformed. She snapped to rigid attention, rendered a perfect military salute, and in a voice filled with profound respect declared, "It's an honor to be in your presence, Sergeant Major. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." What would you do if you discovered that the person you've been looking down on, the woman whose expertise you've questioned simply because she wore grease-stained coveralls instead of a business suit, was actually one of the most lethal and decorated snipers in military history? What if the hands you assumed could only turn wrenches had once steadied a rifle with precision that saved hundreds of lives in the world's most dangerous combat zones? Let's find out what happens when 15 years of assumptions collide with a truth so shocking it will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the heroes walking among us. The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of Davidson's auto repair in Millbrook Heights, Arizona, as 38-year-old Riley Castellano wiped sweat and grime from her forehead with the back of her weathered hand. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, streaked with premature silver that spoke of stresses most people couldn't imagine. The intricate tattoo on her shoulder blade, usually hidden beneath her work clothes, depicted an eagle perched on a mountain peak with crosshairs centered below it, surrounded by coordinates and numbers that would mean nothing to civilians but everything to those who understood their significance. This wasn't supposed to be how her day ended. Riley had been looking forward to closing up shop early for once, maybe grabbing dinner at Martinez Diner down the street where the owner, old Pete Martinez, still remembered to ask about her mother's health and always slipped an extra piece of pie onto her plate. She'd been planning to swing by Riverside Cemetery afterward, as she did every month, to visit the headstone that bore no mention of the classified missions or the lives saved by extraordinary marksmanship in places whose names appeared in no official records. For 15 years, Riley had found peace in the honest work of fixing engines, diagnosing problems that had logical solutions, and helping families keep their vehicles running when money was tight. The residents of Millbrook Heights knew her as the reliable mechanic who charged fair prices, worked long hours, and never talked much about her past. They saw calloused hands that could rebuild a transmission, not fingers that had once squeezed triggers with precision measured in fractions of inches across distances that would make most people dizzy to contemplate. She'd chosen this life deliberately, the anonymity, the simple problems with concrete solutions, the community of working-class neighbors who judged her by the quality of her repairs rather than the secrets she carried. In this small Arizona town, she was just Riley from the auto shop, the woman who could fix anything with 4 wheels and an engine, who sponsored the local high school's automotive program, and who occasionally helped elderly customers with grocery runs when their cars were in for service. But today, that carefully constructed peaceful existence was about to collide with a past she'd buried deeper than any engine block she'd ever worked on. The black luxury sedan that had pulled into her bay 30 minutes earlier wasn't like the usual pickup trucks, family minivans, and aging sedans that made up her typical clientele. Its occupants, 3 men who introduced themselves as federal contractors investigating irregularities in government, vehicle maintenance contracts, had been asking increasingly pointed questions about her background, her certifications, and her right to service vehicles with certain security classifications. Riley had been bent over the sedan's engine compartment, her coveralls unzipped and tied around her waist due to the desert heat, when she heard the approaching footsteps of what sounded like a fourth person joining the group. She could feel multiple sets of eyes on her as she worked, suspicious glances from men who saw only a female mechanic in stained work clothes, someone they assumed couldn't possibly have the clearance or expertise to work on the sophisticated vehicle they'd brought to her shop. She'd ignored their whispered conversations about security protocols and proper authorization, focusing instead on the mechanical problem at hand, a complex issue with the engine's computer system that required the kind of advanced diagnostic skills she'd honed not just through 15 years of civilian auto repair, but through specialized military training most people didn't know existed. Her fingers moved with practiced precision through components that required both mechanical expertise and an understanding of classified systems that appeared in vehicles most mechanics would never encounter. The sound of military dress shoes on concrete made Riley pause in her work, but she didn't look up immediately. Years of situational awareness, honed in environments where a moment's inattention could mean the difference between life and death, told her that the dynamic in her shop had suddenly shifted. The fourth person's bearing, the respectful tone that had entered the contractor's voices, the subtle change in posture she could sense without seeing, all indicated that someone with real authority had just arrived. When she finally straightened up and turned around, her shoulder blade fully visible where her tank top had shifted during her work, Riley found herself face to face with Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, a woman whose reputation in military circles was legendary, whose respect was earned through decades of service in the most challenging theaters of operation. The moment Hawthorne's experienced eyes registered the intricate tattoo, the eagle, the crosshairs, the coordinates that marked Riley as a graduate of the military's most elite sniper training program, everything changed. The three contractors, who had been treating Riley with barely concealed condescension, suddenly stepped back, uncertainty replacing their earlier arrogance. Colonel Hawthorne's salute wasn't just a gesture of military courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of service, sacrifice, and skills that transcended rank and spoke to a brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat operations most people couldn't imagine. In that moment, 15 years of carefully maintained anonymity evaporated, and Riley Castellano, former sergeant major, distinguished marksman, and decorated veteran of operations so classified they appeared in no public record, found herself once again standing at the intersection of her hidden past and the quiet life she'd built in its shadow, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I want you to really think about this as we dive deeper into what happened that scorching afternoon in Millbrook Heights. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you completely misjudged someone based on first impressions. Were you the one doing the judging, or were you the one being underestimated? Your stories matter, and they connect us all in ways that might surprise you. Hit that like button if you've ever felt invisible in your job, if you've ever been dismissed because of how you looked or what you did for a living. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because Riley's story is about to take turns that will challenge everything you think you know about the heroes hiding in plain sight all around us. Here's the question that's going to haunt you long after this video ends. What if the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one trying to look intimidating? What if it's the quiet one in the corner, the one everyone overlooks, the one whose hands are stained with honest work, but whose eyes hold secrets that could rewrite history books? What if the person you just cut off in traffic, complained about to their manager, or treated as invisible, has skills that have literally saved nations? The truth about Riley Castellano, and I'm going to share every shocking detail with you. is going to make you question every interaction you've ever had with a service worker, every assumption you've made about someone's background based on their current job, and every time you've confused someone's choice to live quietly with their inability to live loudly. See, what those 3 federal contractors didn't know is they stood in that sweltering auto repair bay, looking down at Riley like she was just another small-town mechanic who'd gotten lucky with a government contract, was that they were standing in the presence of someone whose military file was so classified that even mentioning her real service record required security clearances most generals don't possess. Riley had spent 15 entire years, listening to customers question her expertise, watching people assume that because she was a woman working with her hands in a blue-collar job, she must not be smart enough for anything else. She'd endured countless interactions with men who insisted on explaining simple automotive concepts to her, who demanded to speak to the real mechanic, who acted like she'd won some kind of lottery by landing a job at Davidson's auto shop instead of recognizing that she'd deliberately chosen this life every single day for over a decade. Riley had bitten her tongue when customers implied she was overcharging them, when they questioned her diagnoses, when they suggested she didn't know what she was talking about. She'd smiled politely when people made jokes about lady mechanics, when they asked if she was sure she could handle their complicated car problems, when they treated her like she was playing dress-up in a man's profession. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the discipline it took for someone trained to eliminate threats with surgical precision to instead patiently explain why their alternator needed replacing. They didn't recognize the self-control required for hands that had once held the power of life and death to gently guide elderly customers through the basics of car maintenance. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had voluntarily walked away from a career where her skills were legendary, where her reputation preceded her into rooms full of the world's most elite military personnel. The 3 contractors who'd shown up that afternoon, Agent Derek Thornfield, Agent Michael Brennan, and Agent Samuel Cross, represented everything Riley had grown tired of in her previous life. They carried themselves with the arrogant confidence of men who'd never had their authority questioned, who'd never been underestimated, who'd never had to prove themselves in rooms where everyone expected them to fail. They'd arrived at Davidson's auto shop following up on what they called irregularities in maintenance records for certain government vehicles. In reality, they were part of a bureaucratic investigation into cost overruns in federal fleet management, the kind of paper-pushing audit that happens when politicians need to look like they're fighting waste, but don't want to tackle real problems. Their assumption, walking into Riley's shop, was simple. They were dealing with a small-town mechanic who'd somehow gotten her hands on contracts she didn't deserve, probably through affirmative action programs or diversity initiatives. They saw a woman in coveralls and immediately decided she represented everything wrong with government. Contracting incompetence rewarded over merit, politics over performance. What they were about to discover would shatter not just their assumptions about Riley, but their understanding of what real merit actually looks like. They were about to learn that sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one everyone underestimates, that true strength often chooses to operate quietly rather than loudly, and that the deadliest predators are the ones you never see coming. But before Colonel Patricia Hawthorne stepped out of that black SUV and changed everything with a single salute, Riley had been living a carefully constructed life built on the radical idea that a person's worth isn't determined by their past achievements, their security clearances, or the respect they command from strangers. She'd chosen to measure her value by different metrics. The single mother who could afford to keep her minivan running because Riley kept her prices fair. The teenager she'd taught basic car maintenance to help them save money. The elderly veterans who found someone who understood their stories without them having to explain. For 15 years, Riley had been proving every single day that heroism isn't always about the dramatic moments that make headlines. Sometimes it's about showing up, doing good work, treating people with dignity, and building a community one honest interaction at a time. But the thing about heroes who choose to live quietly is that eventually, inevitably, their past catches up with them. And when it does, the collision between who they were and who they've chosen to become can reshape everyone around them. That collision was about to happen in a way that would leave 3 arrogant federal contractors questioning everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and what it really means to serve your country. The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Riley Castellano. She'd arrived at Davidson's auto shop at 6:30 a.m., a full hour before her official opening time, carrying a thermos of black coffee and wearing the same oil-stained coveralls that had become her uniform over the past 15 years. The early morning quiet of Millbrook Heights was something she'd grown to treasure. The way the desert sunrise painted the mountains in shades of orange and pink, the cool air that would disappear within hours under the relentless Arizona sun, and the peaceful moments before the day's chaos began. At 38, Riley moved with an economy of motion that most people attributed to years of mechanical work, but those with trained eyes might recognize something more precise, more deliberate. Every gesture served a purpose. Every step was calculated. When she walked around a vehicle, she unconsciously checked sight lines and exit routes, habits so deeply ingrained they'd become automatic after 2 decades. Even though she'd left that world behind long ago, her morning routine was methodical and unchanging. First, she'd unlock the shop and conduct a complete security sweep, something she told herself was just good business practice but knew was really about making sure her sanctuary remained safe. She'd check the 3 service bays, the parts storage room, her small office in the back, and the customer waiting area with its mismatched chairs and decade-old magazines. Only after confirming everything was exactly as she'd left would she start the coffee pot and begin her day. Riley had inherited Davidson's auto shop from Ernest Davidson, a gruff but kind-hearted man who'd given her a chance when she first arrived in Millbrook Heights in 2009, fresh out of the military and looking for something as far removed from her previous life as possible. Ernest had been skeptical at first, not because she was a woman, but because she was clearly overqualified for the position, and he'd seen too many restless souls drift through small towns without putting down roots. But Riley had surprised him. She'd worked harder than any employee he'd ever had, arrived early and stayed late, and treated every customer's beat-up sedan like it was a precision instrument deserving of respect. When Ernest's diabetes finally forced him into retirement 3 years later, he'd offered to sell her the shop for a fraction of its value, telling her that some people were meant to be caretakers of places and traditions, and he could see that quality in her. The shop itself was a testament to Riley's character, immaculately organized. Despite handling the messiest of jobs, tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboards. Parts were cataloged and stored with military precision. The floor was swept clean every evening, and oil stains were scrubbed away immediately. Customers often commented on how unusual it was to find an auto repair shop that was cleaner than most people's kitchens. What they didn't realize was that this level of organization wasn't about pride or perfectionism, it was about control. For someone whose previous job had required split-second decisions based on perfect information, chaos of any kind created anxiety that could be overwhelming. The shop's order was Riley's way of creating peace in a world that had once demanded she be ready for violence at any moment. Her customer base had grown steadily over the years, through word-of-mouth recommendations and her reputation for honest work at fair prices. She specialized in older vehicles, the kind of cars that other shops might recommend replacing rather than repairing. Riley had a gift for finding solutions that kept families mobile without breaking their budgets. She'd rebuilt transmissions for single mothers, kept ancient pickup trucks running for retired ranchers, and helped college students squeeze a few more months out of cars that should have died years earlier. The relationships she'd built in Millbrook Heights were genuine, but carefully maintained at a certain distance. She sponsored the high school automotive program, contributed to local charities, and helped neighbors when they needed it. But she never let anyone get close enough to start asking detailed questions about her past. People knew she was a veteran. The discipline and work ethic made that obvious, but she'd perfected the art of deflecting deeper inquiries with humor and subject changes. Her living situation reflected the same careful balance between community, engagement, and personal privacy. Riley owned a small ranch-style house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by 2 acres of desert landscape that provided natural barriers and clear sight lines in all directions. The house was modest but meticulously maintained, with a workshop garage that contained tools and equipment most mechanics could only dream of owning. The morning routine at home was as structured as the one at the shop. Riley woke at 5:15 a.m. Without an alarm clock, her internal clock had been calibrated by years of military precision and never seemed to need adjustment. She'd make coffee, check the perimeter of her property during what she called her morning walk, but was really a security sweep, and read the news while eating breakfast that never varied. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and fresh fruit when it was in season. Her neighbors saw her as friendly but private, helpful but self-sufficient. She'd fix a broken fence for the elderly couple next door, help jumpstart a dead battery, or offer technical advice about car problems, but she never lingered for lengthy conversations. People respected her boundaries because she respected theirs, and over 15 years, she'd become woven into the fabric of the community without anyone really knowing who she'd been before. Millbrook Heights stopped the transformation from her previous life hadn't been easy. The first few years had been marked by hypervigilance that made simple social interactions exhausting, nightmares that left her afraid to sleep, and a constant sense of being watched that made crowded spaces nearly unbearable. But working with her hands, solving mechanical problems that had logical solutions, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than military hierarchy had slowly healed wounds that she'd thought might never close. Riley had chosen automotive repair specifically because it was honest work that required focus and skill, but didn't involve life or death decisions. Every day, she worked to fix things rather than destroy them, to help people rather than eliminate threats, to build something lasting rather than carry out missions that would disappear into classified files. The contrast had been intentional and therapeutic. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as she prepared to service a black sedan that had been dropped off the previous evening by what the appointment book listed as federal contractors, Riley felt a familiar tension in her shoulders, the kind of alertness that had once meant the difference between completing missions successfully and not coming home at all. She'd learned to trust these instincts, even in civilian life. Something about the vehicle, the appointment made without the usual small talk, and the way the men had studied her shop while dropping off the car had triggered warning signals she'd hoped never to feel again. As she approached the sedan and began her diagnostic routine, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed, peaceful life was about to collide with a past she'd worked so hard to leave behind. The morning sun was already brutal. At 9 a.m. when the 3 men in expensive suits arrived to observe her work, and Riley knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't going to be just another routine repair. Job. Agent Derek Thornfield stepped out of the air-conditioned government SUV into the blazing Arizona heat, immediately loosening his tie and squinting against the desert sun. At 45, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd spent his entire career in bureaucratic positions where his authority was rarely questioned. His perfectly pressed suit, polished shoes, and manicured appearance stood in stark contrast to the working-class environment of Davidson's auto shop, and he seemed to relish the distinction. "This is the place?" Agent Michael Brennan asked, consulting his tablet while surveying the modest repair shop with obvious disdain. Brennan was younger, maybe 35, with the kind of aggressive ambition that came from Ivy League credentials and A burning need to prove himself worthy of more prestigious assignments. He'd been hoping this investigation would uncover major fraud something, career-making that would get him noticed by the higher-ups in Washington. The third man, Agent Samuel Cross, remained silent as he examined the shop's exterior with calculating eyes. Cross had 20 years of experience in government investigations, and unlike his colleagues, he'd learned to withhold judgment until facts were established. Something about this assignment bothered him: the vague nature of their orders, the lack of specific allegations, and the unusual interest from supervisors who typically delegated such routine matters to junior staff. Riley looked up from the sedan's engine compartment as the three men approached her service bay. She'd been expecting them since their appointment was scheduled for 10 a.m., but their body language immediately set off alarm bells that years of combat experience had permanently wired into her nervous system. The way Thornfield's eyes swept the shop, looking for weaknesses rather than taking in the business. The way Brennan held his tablet like a weapon, ready to document any perceived violation. The way Cross positioned himself to block her exit route to the rear of the shop. "You must be Ms. Castellano," Thornfield announced rather than asked, his tone carrying the kind of condescending authority that implied she should be grateful for his attention. "I'm Agent Thornfield, Federal Bureau of Vehicle Standards and Compliance. These are my associates, Agent Brennan and Agent Cross. We're here about the irregularities in your government service contracts." Riley straightened slowly, wiping her hands on a shop rag while maintaining eye contact. "Irregularities?" she repeated, her voice level despite the tension building in her chest. "I wasn't aware there were any problems with my work. All my certifications are current, and I've never had a customer complaint about quality or pricing." Brennan stepped forward, consulting his tablet with theatrical importance. "According to our records, you've been servicing classified government vehicles for the past 3 years without proper security clearance verification. That's a serious violation of federal contracting regulations." "I service the vehicles I'm assigned through the Regional Fleet Management Office," Riley replied carefully. "I perform the requested maintenance, document all work performed, and submit my invoices through the proper channels. If there's been an administrative error in the clearance verification process, I'm happy to provide whatever documentation you need." Thornfield exchanged a meaningful look with Brennan, the kind of nonverbal communication that suggested they'd discuss their approach before arriving. "The problem, Miss Castellano, is that someone in your position, a small-town mechanic with apparent security background, shouldn't have access to vehicles with the classification levels we're seeing in your service records." The subtle emphasis on "someone in your position" wasn't lost on Riley. She'd heard that tone before, in dozens of interactions over the years where people made assumptions about her capabilities based on her current job, her gender, or their preconceived notions about who belonged in which roles. But coming from federal agents, the implication carried additional weight and potential consequences. "Could you be more specific about which vehicles or what classification issues you're concerned about?" Riley asked, genuinely trying to understand the nature of their investigation. "I maintain detailed records of all work performed, including part numbers, labor hours, and any special requirements specified in the work orders." Cross spoke for the first time, his voice more measured than his colleagues. "Miss Castellano, some of the vehicles you've serviced contain electronic systems and communication equipment that require specialized clearances to access. We need to understand how someone without military or intelligence backgrounds gained authorization to work on such sensitive machinery." Riley felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when her civilian identity brushed up against the classified world she'd left behind. The careful compartmentalization she'd maintained for 15 years was being challenged by people who had no idea what they were really asking about. "I work on the mechanical systems, engines, transmissions, brakes, basic electrical, she explained patiently. I don't access communication equipment or electronic systems beyond standard automotive computers. If there are specialized components in these vehicles, I'm not aware of them, and I certainly don't have access to anything that would require security clearances. Brennan looked up from his tablet with a smirk that suggested he'd found what he was looking for. But that's just it, Miss Castellano. Our technical analysis shows that someone with your level of access could easily compromise sensitive systems, either intentionally or through incompetence. The fact that you claim not to be aware of these systems suggests either deception or a level of technical ignorance that makes you unsuitable for this type of work. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Riley felt 15 years of careful self-control being tested by the casual arrogance of men who'd probably never worked with their hands, never been responsible for keeping critical systems operational under adverse conditions, and certainly never been trusted with life or death. Responsibilities that required both technical expertise and unshakable integrity. I've been servicing vehicles professionally for over 15 years, Riley said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. My work speaks for itself. If you have specific concerns about any particular repair or maintenance procedure, I'm happy to walk you through my documentation and explain my methods. Thornfield stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. The concern, Miss Castellano, is that you might be in over your head. These aren't typical civilian vehicles. They require a level of technical sophistication and security awareness that, frankly, we're not seeing evidence of in your background. My background? Riley repeated, genuine confusion mixing with growing anger. What exactly have you researched about my background? Standard federal contractor verification, Brennan replied, waving his tablet dismissively. High school diploma. Community college automotive program, 15 years at this shop. Nothing that would qualify you for the level of responsibility you've been given. Riley stared at the three men, realizing they had no idea who they were really talking to. Their standard federal contractor verification had clearly accessed only her civilian employment records, missing entirely the decades of military service. That had ended with classification so high that most federal agents wouldn't have the clearance to view them. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here were 3 government investigators questioning her qualifications to work on sensitive vehicles. When her actual background included training on systems these men couldn't even imagine existed. They were worried about her competence to service communication equipment, when she'd once been trusted with technology that could change the outcome of international conflicts, but explaining any of that would require revealing information that remained classified, breaking cover she'd maintained for 15 years, and opening doors to a past she'd worked desperately to keep closed. Instead, she was forced to stand there and listen to men with security badges and government authority question whether a small-town mechanic could be trusted with work she was exponentially overqualified to perform. Gentlemen, Riley said. Finally, her patience wearing thin. I understand you have a job to do, but I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish here. If there are specific technical concerns about my work, I'm happy to address them. If there are administrative issues, with my clearance status, I'll work with the appropriate offices to resolve them. But I've done nothing wrong, and I don't appreciate the implication that I'm either incompetent or untrustworthy. Thornfield's smile was cold and patronizing. Miss Castellano, I think you misunderstand the situation. We're not here to negotiate or work with you to resolve issues. We're here to determine whether you represent a security risk that needs to be eliminated. The word eliminated sent a chill through Riley that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. In her previous life, that word had very specific meanings, none of them involving paperwork or administrative sanctions. The casual way Thornfield had used it suggested either ignorance of its implications or a deliberate attempt to intimidate her with language that carried darker connotations. Cross was watching her reaction carefully, and Riley realized that unlike his colleagues, he might actually have enough experience to recognize when someone was more than they appeared to be. The question was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to get through this investigation without having to reveal truths that would complicate not just her own life, but potentially national security interests that extended far beyond. A routine federal audit thought the tension in the shop grew thicker as Agent Brennan pulled out a digital camera and began photographing Riley's workspace without asking permission. His flash reflected off the polished tools hanging on their designated hooks, capturing the meticulous organization that Riley had maintained for 15 years. Each photograph felt like a violation, an invasion of the sanctuary she'd built to escape exactly this kind of scrutiny. "Standard documentation procedures," Brennan announced, though his tone suggested he was enjoying the power dynamic. He moved methodically through the service bay, photographing her tool arrangements, parts inventory, and the diagnostic equipment she'd invested thousands of dollars in upgrading over the years. "We'll need a complete record of your capabilities and resources for our assessment." Riley watched him work, fighting the urge to demand a warrant or some legal justification for what felt increasingly like harassment disguised as an investigation. But she also knew that challenging federal agents too aggressively could escalate the situation in ways that might force her to make revelations she wasn't prepared for. "I notice you have some rather sophisticated diagnostic equipment for a small town operation," Thornfield observed, running his finger along the edge of her computerized engine analyzer. The machine was indeed advanced, capable of interfacing with the most modern vehicle computer systems and providing detailed analysis that most independent shops couldn't afford. "This particular model requires specialized training to operate effectively. Where exactly did you receive that training?" The question was loaded with implication. Riley had purchased the equipment 3 years earlier when she'd started getting contracts for newer government vehicles, but her ability to use it effectively came from technical training that predated her civilian career by decades. Military mechanics worked on far more complex systems than civilian vehicles, often under field conditions that required adapting to unfamiliar technology with minimal documentation. "The manufacturer provides comprehensive training programs," Riley replied, which was technically true, though it didn't explain how she'd mastered the system so quickly, or why she could troubleshoot problems that stumped technicians with formal certifications. "I also learned from online resources, technical manuals, and networking with other professionals in the field." Cross had been quietly examining the sedan she'd been working on, running his hands along the vehicle's frame and peering under the hood with more knowledge than his colleagues seemed to possess. When he straightened up, his expression was thoughtful rather than accusatory. "This vehicle has been modified significantly from its factory specifications," he said, addressing his colleagues rather than Riley. "The engine compartment shows signs of custom work that goes well beyond routine maintenance. Someone has upgraded the cooling system, reinforced the suspension components, and installed what appears to be a secondary electrical system." Riley felt her pulse quicken. The modifications Cross was describing weren't visible to casual observers. They required the kind of trained eye that came from extensive experience with specialized vehicles. The fact that he'd spotted them so quickly suggested his background was more complex than the generic federal investigator title implied. "Those modifications were already present when the vehicle was delivered for service," Riley said carefully. "I was instructed to maintain the existing systems, not to alter or upgrade anything. My work orders specifically stated that I should focus on routine maintenance while preserving all existing configurations." Brennan lowered his camera, his expression shifting from smugness to genuine concern. "You're saying these modifications were already in place? That you've been maintaining custom systems without understanding their purpose or function?" The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had been driving their entire investigation. The agents had assumed Riley was unauthorized to work on sensitive vehicles, when in reality, she'd been specifically selected because someone in the federal bureaucracy understood exactly what her qualifications were, even if these particular investigators didn't have access to that information. "I understand the systems I work on," Riley replied, choosing her words carefully. "But I only work on the components specified in my service orders. If there are other systems in these vehicles that I'm not supposed to access, then whoever wrote my work orders made sure I wouldn't encounter them during routine maintenance." Thornfield and Brennan exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't the explanation they'd been expecting. Their investigation had been premised on the assumption that Riley was an unqualified contractor who'd somehow gained inappropriate access to sensitive vehicles. The possibility that she'd been deliberately selected by someone who understood her capabilities clearly hadn't occurred to them. "Who exactly provides your work orders?" Cross asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "These contracts come through regional fleet management, but the technical specifications suggest input from someone with specialized knowledge of these particular vehicles." Riley felt like she was walking through a minefield. The truth was that her government contracts had always come with unusually detailed specifications and generous compensation, suggesting that someone in the system knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. But acknowledging that would raise questions about why her background check had apparently missed her military service record. "I receive work orders through the standard federal fleet management system," she said. "The technical requirements are usually very specific, which I've always assumed was just government thoroughness. I follow the instructions, document my work, and submit my reports through the proper channels." Brennan was scrolling through something on his tablet, his expression growing more confused. "According to the Regional Fleet Management Office, they don't have any record of authorizing classified vehicle maintenance at this location. In fact, they show your contracts as limited to standard civilian-grade government vehicles, postal service trucks, agency fleet cars, basic transportation." The revelation hit Riley like a physical blow. If the regional office had no record of the specialized contracts she'd been fulfilling for 3 years, then someone else was routing work to her through unofficial channels. Someone who knew about her background and capabilities, but was operating outside normal bureaucratic procedures. "That doesn't make sense," Riley said, genuine confusion replacing her earlier defensiveness. "I have documentation for every vehicle I've serviced, including the work orders, parts authorizations, and payment confirmations. If there's a discrepancy in the regional office records, then there's been some kind of administrative error." Cross was studying her face intently, and Riley realized he was evaluating whether her confusion was genuine or performed. After a long moment, he nodded slightly, as if reaching some internal conclusion. "Miss Castellano," he said, his voice taking on a different tone, "I think we need to consider the possibility that you've been unknowingly involved in something more complex than a simple contracting irregularity. The vehicles you've been working on, the unauthorized work orders, and the disconnect between what you've been doing and what the regional office knows about, this suggests a deliberate operation that's been using your shop for purposes you may not be aware of." Thornfield stepped forward aggressively. "Are you suggesting she's been used as an unwitting asset in some kind of covert operation?" "That's a serious accusation, Cross. We're here to investigate contractor fraud, not international espionage." "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Cross replied calmly. "But I am saying that the evidence doesn't support our original assumptions about Ms. Castellano's unauthorized access to sensitive systems. Instead, it suggests that someone with significant authority has been deliberately routing specialized work to her location while keeping it off the official books." Riley felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. For 15 years, she'd assumed her government contracts were legitimate work filtered through normal bureaucratic channels. The possibility that someone had been using her shop for unofficial purposes, trading on her background and skills without her knowledge, opened up scenarios that could threaten not just her carefully constructed civilian life, but potentially national security operations she had no knowledge of. The three agents were now looking at her not as a suspected fraud, but as a potential victim or unwitting participant in something much larger and more dangerous than a routine audit could address. And Riley realized that her quiet life in Millbrook Heights was about to become much more complicated than she'd ever imagined possible. The desert heat seemed to intensify as the implications of Cross's words settled over the group. Riley felt sweat beading on her forehead, the weather from the Arizona sun or the growing realization that her carefully controlled world was unraveling. She couldn't say. The three agents stood in varying degrees of alertness, their body language shifting from routine investigation to something approaching operational readiness. Agent Thornfield was the first to break the silence, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine concern tinged with bureaucratic panic. Cross, if what you're suggesting is accurate, then we're looking at a potential security breach that goes far beyond our mandate. We need to contact our supervisors immediately and request guidance on how to proceed. No, Cross said sharply, his tone carrying an authority that surprised both his colleagues and Riley. If there's an unofficial operation using this location, then premature communication could compromise ongoing security interests or alert hostile actors that we've identified their methods. We need to understand the full scope of what's been happening here before we involve additional personnel. Brennan had gone pale, his ambitious dreams of career advancement clearly being replaced by fears of stepping into something that could end careers rather than make them. You're talking about the possibility of rogue operations, unauthorized use of federal resources, maybe even foreign intelligence involvement. We're not equipped to handle that level of investigation. Riley watched the three men grapple with implications that were becoming clearer to her by the moment. Someone with high-level access had been routing specialized maintenance work to her shop, trading on skills and clearances she'd officially left behind 15 years ago. The question was whether this was a legitimate but compartmentalized operation that these agents simply weren't cleared to know about, or something more sinister that had been exploiting her background without authorization. "Gentlemen," Riley interjected, her voice steady despite the chaos building in her mind. "Before this situation escalates further, perhaps we should focus on establishing some basic facts. I have documentation of every vehicle I've worked on, every work order I've received, and every payment I've processed. If you're serious about understanding what's been happening here, that documentation might provide answers we all need." Cross nodded approvingly. "That's the logical next step. We need to examine your records and compare them against official government databases to determine which contracts were legitimate and which were routed through unofficial channels." Riley led the three agents toward her office, a small room at the back of the shop that served as her administrative center. The space was as meticulously organized as her work areas, with filing cabinets arranged in logical order and a computer system that, while not cutting edge, was more sophisticated than most small businesses required. As she began pulling files from cabinets, Rayleigh's mind raced through the implications of what they might discover. If her suspicions were correct, then someone had been using her skills for operations that existed in the gray areas between official and unofficial government activity. The kind of work that required plausible deniability and contractors who could be trusted to perform specialized tasks without asking inconvenient questions. "Here are the work orders for the past 3 years, Riley said, spreading folders across her desk. Each file contains the original service request, parts documentation, labor records, and completion reports. The payment authorizations come through a different system, but I have records of those as well." Brennan immediately began photographing the documents, while Cross and Thornfield examined the paperwork more carefully. What they found was a pattern that confirmed their worst fears: highly detailed technical specifications for work that should have required specialized clearances, authorization codes that didn't match standard federal procurement procedures, and payment structures that bypassed normal government accounting systems. These authorization codes, Cross said, pointing to a series of numbers and letters at the top of each work order, they're not consistent with any federal procurement system I'm familiar with. They follow the right general format, but the specific sequences don't match any database I have access to. Thornfield was examining the technical specifications with growing alarm. Some of these modifications you've been asked to perform, they're not routine maintenance. You've been upgrading communication systems, installing specialized electronic components, and modifying engine performance characteristics in ways that would change these vehicles' operational capabilities. Riley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She'd performed all the requested work competently, but she'd assumed the modifications were within the scope of normal government vehicle requirements. The possibility that she'd been unknowingly participating in operations that existed outside legal oversight was deeply disturbing. "I followed the specifications exactly as written," she said, her voice tight with growing concern. The work orders were always extremely detailed, with precise technical requirements and quality standards. I assumed that level of specificity was just typical government thoroughness. Cross was comparing her documentation against something on his laptop, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Ms. Castellano, I need to ask you directly. Have you ever been contacted by anyone claiming to represent government agencies outside of the normal work order process? Any phone calls, personal visits, or informal requests for information about the work you've been performing?" The question triggered a memory that Riley had filed away as insignificant at the time. About 6 months earlier, a woman had appeared at her shop claiming to be conducting a routine quality assurance survey for federal fleet management. She'd asked detailed questions about Riley's capabilities, her equipment, and her background, but the conversation had felt more like an assessment than a survey. "There was a woman," Riley said slowly, "about 6 months ago. She said she was from Federal Fleet Management, conducting quality assurance reviews. But now that I think about it, she asked more questions about my personal background and technical capabilities than about customer satisfaction or service quality." Brennan stopped photographing documents and looked up sharply. "Did she provide identification? Do you remember her name or what agency she claimed to represent?" Riley closed her eyes, trying to recall details that hadn't seemed important at the time. "She had a badge and identification, but I didn't examine them closely. Professional appearance, probably in her 40s, short blonde hair. She said her name was Jennifer something Morrison, maybe, or Morrison. She knew details about my work that suggested she'd reviewed my files thoroughly before the visit." The 3 agents exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Cross was typing rapidly on his laptop, apparently running searches based on Riley's description. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression that confirmed Riley's growing fears. "There's no record of any quality assurance visits to your location in Federal Fleet Management databases," he said. "And the name Jennifer Morrison doesn't appear in any agency personnel records I can access with my current clearance level." Thornfield was now pacing the small office, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by professional anxiety. "We're looking at a sophisticated operation that's been using Ms. Castellano's shop as an asset for unauthorized vehicle modifications. Someone with access to government systems has been routing work to her using fabricated authorization codes and false documentation. But who?" Brennan asked, his voice reflecting the confusion they were all feeling. "And why? What would be the purpose of conducting unauthorized vehicle modifications through a civilian contractor?" Riley felt the weight of 15 years of secrets pressing against her consciousness. The answer to Brennan's question might lie in her military background in operations and capabilities that remained classified long after her official service had ended. But revealing that information would shatter the civilian identity she'd worked so hard to construct and potentially expose national security interests that extended far beyond this immediate crisis. As the three agents continued their analysis of her documentation, Riley realized that her quiet life in Millbrook Heights was ending, whether she wanted it to or not. The careful balance she'd maintained between her past and present was collapsing, and soon she would have to make choices about how much truth she was prepared to reveal and what consequences she was willing to accept. Outside, the sound of another vehicle approaching broke through the tension in the office. Through the window, Riley could see a black SUV with government plates pulling into her parking area. As the vehicle's doors opened, she caught a glimpse of military dress uniform and felt her pulse quicken with recognition and dread. Her past wasn't just catching up with her. It was arriving with official authority and the power to reshape everything she'd built in Millbrook Heights. Colonel Patricia Hawthorne stepped out of the black SUV with the precise movements of someone accustomed to command. At 52, she carried herself with an authority that had been earned through 3 decades of military service in some of the world's most challenging theaters of operation. Her dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and insignia perfectly positioned, and her silver eagles caught the harsh Arizona sunlight as she surveyed Davidson's auto shop with the calculating gaze of a professional strategist. Behind her emerged Captain Rodriguez, a younger officer whose role was clearly that of aid and security, and Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a civilian analyst whose presence suggested this visit involved more than routine military business. The three moved with coordinated purpose toward the shop, their bearing so distinctly military that even civilian observers would recognize them as people of significant importance. Inside the office, the sound of car doors slamming caused all 4 occupants to look toward the window. Cross was the first to react, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he recognized the implications of military personnel arriving at what was supposed to be a routine federal contracting investigation. "We have company," he announced, his voice tight with tension. "Military officers, by the look of them." This situation just became much more complicated. Thornfield moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the approaching delegation. "That's a full colonel leading the group. Colonels don't show up for routine contractor audits. Whatever we've stumbled into here, it's attracted attention from very high levels of the military hierarchy." Riley felt her world shifting in ways she'd dreaded for 15 years. The sight of Colonel Hawthorne's uniform, the practiced movements of military personnel conducting an official visit, and the realization that her civilian cover was about to be permanently compromised, triggered responses she'd hoped never to experience again. Her pulse quickened, her breathing became more controlled, and her situational awareness expanded to include exit routes, potential threats, and defensive positions. Brennan was frantically typing on his tablet, apparently trying to document the developing situation for his superiors. "Should we identify ourselves as federal investigators? Do we have jurisdiction if this becomes a military matter? I'm way out of my depth here." "We all are," Cross replied grimly. "But we're about to find out exactly what kind of operation we've discovered." The sound of military dress shoes on concrete echoed through the shop as the 3 visitors approached the office. Riley stood slowly, unconsciously straightening her posture in a way that would have been imperceptible to the federal agents, but was deeply ingrained from decades of military discipline. Despite wearing oil-stained coveralls in a civilian auto shop, something in her bearing shifted subtly, revealing glimpses of the soldier she'd once been. Colonel Hawthorne appeared in the office doorway, her keen eyes immediately taking in the scene. 3 nervous federal agents, scattered documentation across the desk, and Riley, standing with a composure that suggested she was far more than the civilian mechanic her surroundings implied. "Gentlemen, Hawthorne said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stand straighter without conscious thought. I'm Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, United States Army Intelligence. I believe you've been investigating irregularities in federal vehicle maintenance contracts at this location. Cross stepped forward, apparently designated as spokesman for the group. Yes, ma'am. Agent Cross, Federal Bureau of Vehicle Standards and Compliance. We've discovered evidence of unauthorized vehicle modifications and suspicious contracting procedures that appear to involve classified systems. Hawthorne nodded, her expression revealing nothing about whether this information was expected or surprising. Agent Cross, I'm going to need you and your colleagues to step outside for a few minutes while I speak privately with Ms. Castellano. This conversation involves matters that are classified above your current clearance levels. Thornfield bristled at the dismissal. Colonel, with all due respect, we're conducting a federal investigation here. We have authority under Agent Thornfield, Hawthorne interrupted, her tone remaining professional but carrying an edge that suggested argument would be unwise. You've stumbled into something that intersects with ongoing national security operations. Your investigation has been valuable in identifying a situation that requires military oversight, but from this point forward, this matter falls under my jurisdiction. The three agents exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing that they were outmaneuvered, but reluctant to abandon an investigation they'd barely begun to understand. Cross, showing more wisdom than his colleagues, nodded slowly. We'll wait outside, Colonel. But we'll need to file reports about what we've discovered here, and we'll expect appropriate briefings about any developments that affect our original investigation. Understood, Agent Cross. You'll receive all the information you're cleared to have once this matter is resolved. As the three federal agents reluctantly filed out of the office, Riley found herself alone with Colonel Hawthorne for the first time in over 15 years. The woman studying her with such intensity had been a major when they'd last worked together, serving as liaison between Riley's unit and Army intelligence during operations that remained classified to this day. Hello, Patricia, Riley said quietly, using the colonel's first name for perhaps the last time in what she sensed would be a very different kind of relationship going forward. Riley, Hawthorne replied, her professional demeanor softening slightly. Or should I say, Sergeant Major Castellano? It's been a long time. The use of her former rank felt like a physical blow. For 15 years, Riley had been simply Ms. Castellano, the civilian mechanic who fixed cars and minded her own business. Hearing her military rank spoken aloud in this context felt like watching her carefully constructed civilian identity crumble. In real time. I haven't been Sergeant Major anything for 15 years, Patricia. I'm just Riley now. I fix cars, pay my taxes, and try to live quietly. Whatever brought you here, I hope it doesn't require me to be anyone other than who I've chosen to become. Hawthorne moved closer, her expression mixing professional concern with personal understanding. Riley, someone has been using your shop to modify vehicles for operations that don't appear in any official records. The federal agents who were just here have uncovered evidence of a sophisticated operation that's been trading on your background and skills without proper authorization. Riley felt a familiar weight settling over her, the burden of being pulled back into a world she'd worked so hard to leave behind. I followed the work orders exactly as written, Patricia. I assumed they were legitimate government contracts. If someone was using my shop for unauthorized operations, I wasn't aware of it. I know, Hawthorne said gently, but your background made you the perfect asset for this kind of work. Someone with access to classified information has been exploiting your skills and your sense of duty to country. The question now is whether you're willing to help us identify who's been running this operation and why. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, speaking quietly to the colonel. Ma'am, we've completed the preliminary security sweep. The shop is clean of surveillance devices, but we found evidence of recent visits by unidentified personnel. Someone has been monitoring this location. Riley's blood ran cold. The idea that her shop, her sanctuary, had been under surveillance by unknown parties was deeply disturbing. What kind of evidence? Footprints in areas where customers don't normally go, tool marks suggesting someone examined your equipment, and electronic signatures indicating your computer system has been accessed remotely, Rodriguez explained. Hawthorne turned back to Riley, her expression grave. Riley, I need to ask you directly, have you noticed anything unusual recently? Any sense of being watched, any equipment behaving differently, any customers or visitors who seemed out of place? Riley thought back over the past few months, reassessing interactions and incidents she'd dismissed as insignificant. The woman who'd claimed to be conducting quality assurance surveys. The sedan that had been dropped off with unusually detailed work orders. The feeling of being watched that she'd attributed to small-town curiosity. There have been things, she admitted. But I thought I was being paranoid, reading too much into normal business interactions. After 15 years of civilian life, I assumed I'd lost the edge that made me see threats everywhere. You never lose that edge, Hawthorne said knowingly. You just learn to suppress it. But your instincts were right, Riley. Someone has been using your shop as an operational asset. And we need to find out who before this situation escalates beyond our ability to control it. Outside the office, the 3 federal agents waited with growing impatience and concern, aware that their routine investigation had become something far more significant and potentially dangerous than anything they'd been trained to handle. Dr. Elizabeth Chen entered the office carrying a sealed briefcase and a tablet, displaying classified information that made Riley's stomach tighten with recognition. As a civilian analyst with top-secret clearance, Chen had spent the past decade investigating irregular operations that existed in the shadowy spaces between official military doctrine and practical necessity. Her presence at Davidson's auto shop meant this situation had attracted attention from the highest levels of national security apparatus. Sergeant Major Castellano, Chen said, her voice carrying the respectful tone reserved for decorated veterans. I've been researching your background in preparation for this meeting. Your service record, at least the portions I'm cleared to access, is remarkable. But it's what's been redacted from your file that brings me here today. Riley remained standing, her posture unconsciously shifting to the military bearing that 15 years of civilian life hadn't entirely erased. Dr. Chen, with all due respect, my service record was sealed for good reasons. Whatever operations I participated in were classified then and remain classified now. I've honored those restrictions for 15 years. And that honor is exactly why someone has been exploiting you, Colonel Hawthorne interjected. Riley, the person or organization running unauthorized operations through your shop, knew they could count on your integrity, your technical skills, and your unwillingness to ask inconvenient questions about work orders that seemed legitimate. Chen opened her briefcase and withdrew a series of photographs that she arranged on Riley's desk with clinical precision. The images showed vehicles similar to the ones Riley had been servicing, but photographed in locations that clearly weren't. Civilian repair shops, desert training facilities, urban combat zones, and what appeared to be overseas military installations. These vehicles, Chen explained, have been identified in operations across 3 continents over the past 2 years. Each one shows modifications consistent with the work you've been performing here in Millbrook Heights. Enhanced communications systems, reinforced chassis components, specialized electronic warfare capabilities. Riley studied the photographs with growing unease. The modifications were indeed identical to work she'd performed, but seeing the vehicles in operational contexts revealed their true purpose in ways that routine work orders had obscured. These weren't standard government fleet vehicles, they were specialized assets, designed for covert operations in hostile environments. The question, Hawthorne continued, is whether these operations are being conducted by authorized U.S. military units using unofficial channels, or by hostile actors who've gained access to classified vehicle specifications and are using your shop to create their own capabilities. Captain Rodriguez had been monitoring communications on a specialized device that looked nothing like standard military equipment. He looked up from the display with an expression of concern that immediately commanded attention from both senior officers. "Colonel, we're detecting encrypted communications traffic originating from within a 3-mile radius of this location. The signal patterns are consistent with surveillance and coordination activities, but they're using encryption protocols I don't recognize." Riley felt the familiar hyper-awareness that had kept her alive during countless high-risk operations. Someone was actively monitoring this meeting, which meant the investigation had moved beyond academic analysis to active operational status. "How long have they been watching?" "The signals began approximately 20 minutes ago," Rodriguez replied, "which corresponds to our arrival. Whoever is running surveillance on this location responds to military presence, suggesting they have assets positioned for real-time observation." Chun was typing rapidly on her tablet, apparently cross-referencing the surveillance information with other intelligence data. "Colonel, this changes our assessment significantly. If hostile actors are monitoring this location in real time, then they're not just using Ms. Castellano's shop, they're protecting it as an operational asset." Hawthorne moved to the window, her trained eyes scanning the surrounding area for signs of observation posts or surveillance teams. "Riley, I need you to think carefully about the past few months. Any customers who stayed longer than necessary, any service calls that felt unusual, any sense of being observed during your daily routines." Riley's mind raced through recent interactions, now viewing them through the lens of operational security rather than civilian business dealings. "There was a customer about 2 months ago," she said slowly. "Older man, claimed his car was overheating, but when I examined it, there was nothing wrong with the cooling system. He spent almost an hour here, asking questions about my background and how long I'd been running the shop. Can you describe him?" Chun asked, her fingers poised over her tablet. Mid-60s, gray hair, spoke with what might have been a slight accent, Eastern European, maybe Russian. He paid cash and left without getting any actual work done. I thought it was strange at the time, but I assumed he'd just misdiagnosed his car trouble. Hawthorne and Chun exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication. Chun nodded grimly and began typing more intensively on her tablet, apparently running the description against classified databases. "Riley," Hawthorne said, her voice taking on the tone of a commanding officer briefing subordinates for a dangerous mission. "We believe you've been unknowingly supporting operations for a foreign intelligence service. The vehicle modifications you've been performing, the surveillance of your location, and the sophisticated false documentation suggest a level of organization and resources that goes well beyond criminal activity." The revelation hit Riley like a physical blow. For 15 years, she'd believed she was living a quiet civilian life, contributing to her community through honest work and peaceful relationships. The possibility that her skills had been exploited to support hostile foreign operations violated everything she'd stood for during her military service. "If that's true," Riley said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "then whoever's been running this operation has been using my patriotism against me. They knew I'd perform any work that appeared to have legitimate government authorization, and they counted on my integrity to prevent me from asking too many questions." Chun looked up from her tablet with an expression that confirmed Riley's worst fears. "The description you provided matches Vladimir Petrov, a known operative for Russian military intelligence. He's been linked to technology acquisition operations across the United States, focusing on defense contractors and veterans with specialized skills." Rodriguez was monitoring his communications device more intently, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. "Colonel, the surveillance signals are intensifying. Multiple transmitters are now active, and they're using military-grade frequency hopping patterns. Whoever is watching us has significant technical capabilities. Hawthorne made a decision that Riley recognized as the moment when analysis shifted to operational readiness. Captain Rodriguez, contact base security and request immediate backup. Dr. Chun, secure all documentation and prepare for emergency extraction. Riley, I need you to gather any records that might help us identify the full scope of this operation. As the three military personnel moved with practiced efficiency to implement security protocols, Riley realized that her quiet life in Millbrook Heights was permanently over. Whether she'd been an unwitting asset for hostile foreign intelligence or simply a convenient cover for unauthorized American operations, her civilian identity had been compromised beyond repair. But more immediately concerning was the growing certainty that whoever had been using her shop wasn't going to allow their operation to be exposed without a fight. The sophisticated surveillance, the involvement of known foreign intelligence operatives, and the real-time monitoring of their current meeting suggested they were dealing with professionals who had significant resources and the willingness to use them outside the office. The three federal agents who'd started this investigation with routine bureaucratic concerns found themselves witnessing the transformation of Davidson's auto shop from a small-town business into what appeared to be the center of an international intelligence operation. The black SUVs arriving with military personnel, the sophisticated electronic equipment being deployed, and the obviously high-stakes nature of the conversations taking place inside Riley's office made it clear they'd uncovered something far beyond their original mandate. Agent Cross was on his phone with his superiors, trying to explain a situation that defied easy categorization. Agent Thornfield was documenting everything with his camera, recognizing that their routine contractor fraud investigation had become evidence in what might be a counterintelligence operation of national significance. Agent Brennan was simply trying to process the reality that a small-town auto mechanic had somehow become the focal point of what appeared to be an international incident. As Riley gathered her documentation under the watchful eyes of Colonel Hawthorne and Dr. Chun, she knew that within hours, her carefully constructed civilian life would be replaced by something she'd hoped never to experience again. The dangerous uncertainty of active operations where the stakes were measured in national security rather than satisfied customers and honest work. The tension in Davidson's auto shop reached a breaking point when Captain Rodriguez's communications device erupted with urgent alerts. "Colonel, we have movement," he announced, his voice cutting through the late afternoon heat like a blade. "Multiple vehicles approaching from 3 different directions. Professional formation, coordinated timing. This isn't casual surveillance anymore." Through the office window, Riley could see dust clouds rising from the desert roads that led to her shop, kicked up by vehicles moving faster than the posted speed limits would allow. Her 15 years of peaceful civilian life had just ended with the finality of a door slamming shut, and the person responsible for that ending was about to reveal themselves. Colonel Hawthorne immediately shifted into combat command mode, her voice taking on the crisp authority that had directed successful operations in hostile territories around the world. "Rodriguez, establish a secure perimeter. Chun, get on encrypted comms and request immediate backup from Tactical Response Team Delta. Riley, I need you to identify any defensive positions in this building and all possible exit routes." Riley's civilian identity dissolved as military training reasserted itself with startling speed. Her eyes automatically cataloged the shop's layout from a tactical perspective: concrete walls that could provide cover, elevated positions that might offer advantage, and the 3 distinct exit routes she'd unconsciously planned during her first week of ownership 15 years earlier. 2 exits plus the main entrance, she reported with professional efficiency. Emergency exit through the parts storage room leads to the alley behind the building. Secondary exit through the office window provides access to the north parking area. Concrete block construction offers reasonable ballistic protection, but the large windows in the service bays are vulnerabilities. Dr. Chun was speaking rapidly into her secure communication device, her academic demeanor replaced by the urgency of someone who understood they were facing immediate danger. Base, this is Chun. Priority Alpha emergency at Davidson's auto shop. Millbrook Heights. We have confirmed foreign intelligence activity and incoming hostile contact. Request immediate tactical support and counterintelligence backup. Outside, the 3 federal agents who had started this investigation with routine paperwork concerns found themselves witnesses to what was rapidly becoming an active counterintelligence operation. Agent Cross had drawn his sidearm standard, procedure for federal investigators facing potential threats, but his experience with bureaucratic compliance violations hadn't prepared him for international espionage confrontations. Agent Thornfield was on his phone with his regional supervisor, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Sir, I'm telling you, this routine contractor audit has become something involving Army intelligence and what appears to be foreign operatives. We need guidance on jurisdictional issues and immediate backup." Agent Brennan had positioned himself behind their government sedan, using the vehicle as cover while trying to process the transformation of a quiet Arizona auto shop into what looked like the setup for an international incident. His dreams of career advancement through uncovering contractor fraud had been replaced by the sobering realization that he might be witnessing something that would require congressional briefings and classified debriefings. The first hostile vehicle to arrive was a black panel van that pulled into the shop's main parking area with practiced precision. As the van's doors opened, Riley caught sight of the occupants and felt her blood turn cold with recognition and professional respect for their obvious competence. Vladimir Petrov emerged from the passenger seat, no longer disguised as a confused customer with car trouble. At 64, he moved with the calculated efficiency of someone who had conducted similar operations across multiple continents over several decades. His appearance had been altered, different haircut, clothing that suggested American military contractor rather than foreign national, but his eyes held the same cold intelligence Riley remembered from their previous encounter. Behind him came 3 younger operatives whose bearing screamed professional military training. They wore civilian clothes, but moved with coordinated precision that indicated extensive experience in hostile operations. Each carried equipment bags that undoubtedly contained sophisticated surveillance gear, communications equipment, and weapons appropriate for their current mission. "Riley Castellano," Petrov called out, his voice carrying across the parking area. "With confident authority, we need to have a conversation about your recent visitors and the unfortunate attention your business has attracted." Colonel Hawthorne positioned herself where she could observe the hostile team while maintaining cover behind concrete pillars that supported the shop's roof structure. "Riley, do you recognize any of the other operatives?" Riley studied the approaching team with the analytical intensity that had made her one of the military's most effective long-range reconnaissance specialists. "The tall one on the left moved through my shop 2 weeks ago, claiming to be a state inspector checking emissions equipment. The woman with short dark hair was here last month, said she was researching local businesses for a chamber of commerce." Directory. The realization that her shop had been systematically surveilled and assessed by foreign intelligence operatives for months was deeply disturbing, but it also provided tactical information that might prove crucial in the next few minutes. Dr. Chun had completed her emergency communications and was now accessing classified databases on her tablet, apparently trying to identify the hostile operatives through facial recognition software. "Colonel, I'm getting matches on 2 of the team members. Both are known Russian military intelligence officers with extensive experience in technology acquisition and asset recruitment operations." Captain Rodriguez had established a defensive position that allowed him to monitor all approaches to the building while maintaining secure Communications with military backup units. Colonel, I have confirmation that Tactical Response Team Delta is airborne and will arrive in approximately 12 minutes. Local law enforcement has been advised to establish a perimeter, but not to engage unless specifically requested. Riley felt the familiar pre-combat alertness that had kept her alive during countless dangerous operations. The approaching team was professional and experienced, but they were operating on her territory, in a building she knew intimately, with backup coming from the most capable military units in the world. Petrov wants to talk, she observed, which means he believes he can negotiate his way out of this situation. That suggests either he has leverage we don't know about, or he's unaware of how much we've already discovered about his operation. Hawthorne nodded approvingly at Riley's tactical assessment. What's your read on his team's capabilities and intentions? Riley watched the four operatives establish what appeared to be a standard diplomatic approach formation, close enough to communicate effectively, spread out enough to avoid presenting a concentrated target, positioned to retreat quickly if negotiations failed. They're professionals, but this isn't their primary operational environment, Riley concluded. They're trained for urban operations and technology acquisition, not for confronting active military responses in hostile territory. Petrov is betting that his ability to expose me as a compromised asset will give him negotiating power. The federal agents were now positioned behind their vehicle, weapons drawn but clearly uncertain about their role in what had become a military operation. Agent Cross was speaking into his radio, apparently coordinating with his supervisors about jurisdictional issues and backup requirements. Petrov approached to within 30 feet of the shop's main entrance, stopping at a distance that allowed conversation while maintaining tactical options for his team. Colonel Hawthorne, he called out, his English accent free and precisely articulated. I believe we have mutual interests that might be served through discussion rather than confrontation. I'm listening, Hawthorne replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Ms. Castellano has been a valuable asset in our technology acquisition program for nearly 3 years, Petrov continued. She has performed exemplary work and has been compensated fairly for her services. The unfortunate discovery of her activities by your federal investigators creates complications for all parties involved. Riley felt anger building at the casual way Petrov described her unknowing participation in foreign intelligence operations, but she also recognized the tactical opportunity his words presented. He was admitting to criminal activity while making threats that could be used as evidence in counterintelligence prosecutions. What exactly are you proposing? Hawthorne asked, clearly playing for time while backup units approached. Petrov smiled, with the confidence of someone who believed he held the superior position. Miss Castellano continues her valuable work under more discreet arrangements. Your investigation concludes that the irregularities were administrative errors that have been corrected. Everyone returns to their normal activities with no further complications. The proposal was audacious in its simplicity and completely unacceptable in its implications. But it also revealed that Petrov fundamentally misunderstood both Riley's character and the military's commitment to protecting national security interests. Colonel Hawthorne's response would determine whether this confrontation escalated to active combat or provided an opportunity to gather intelligence about the broader Russian operation that had been exploiting American veterans across the country. Colonel Hawthorne's response cut through the desert air with the precision of a surgical strike. Mr. Petrov, your proposal demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of both American military values and the legal consequences of conducting espionage operations on United States soil. Miss Castellano is not your asset, she's an American veteran who was deceived into unknowingly supporting foreign intelligence activities. The words seemed to hit Petrov like physical blows, his confident demeanor cracking as he realized the Americans weren't going to negotiate, for Riley's continued Cooperation. Behind him, his three operatives shifted their positions slightly, recognizing that their diplomatic approach was failing, and preparing for potentially violent alternatives. Riley stepped into view, her coveralls and grease-stained hands contrasting sharply with the military bearing that had reasserted itself over the past hour. When she spoke, her voice carried 15 years of suppressed anger at being manipulated and exploited by people who had traded on her patriotism and sense of duty. "Vladimir," she said, using his first name with deliberate familiarity, "you made a critical error in your assessment of my character. You assumed that because I chose to live quietly, I had somehow become weak or compromised. You thought my civilian life meant I'd forgotten my oath to defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic." Petrov's eyes narrowed as he reassessed the woman he believed was a controllable asset. The Riley Castellano standing before him now bore little resemblance to the compliant mechanic, who had performed modifications without asking inconvenient questions. This was someone whose military training was reasserting itself with alarming speed and competence. Dr. Shun had been monitoring her tablet throughout the confrontation, tracking the approach of military backup while simultaneously running facial recognition and background analysis on the hostile operatives. She looked up from her device with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Colonel, I have complete identification on all 4 hostiles. Petrov and his team are wanted by the FBI for technology theft operations in 6 states. Additionally, the vehicle modifications performed at this location have been linked to attacks on American interests in Eastern Europe and the Middle East." The revelation transformed the situation from espionage investigation to active counterterrorism operation. Riley felt a cold fury building as she realized her unknowing work had contributed to attacks on American personnel overseas. The careful compartmentalization she'd maintained between her military past and civilian present collapsed entirely. Captain Rodriguez's communications device crackled with updates from the approaching tactical response team. "Colonel, Delta Team is 2 minutes out. They're requesting permission to establish overwatch positions on the surrounding buildings and are prepared to initiate capture operations on your command." Petrov had been listening to the American communications with growing alarm, recognizing that his team's extraction window was closing rapidly. His next words carried the desperation of someone realizing their operation had been completely compromised. "Colonel Hawthorne, you're making a mistake that will have consequences beyond this immediate situation. Ms. Castellano's work has been supporting operations that serve American interests, even if those operations exist outside official channels. There are elements within your own government who value the services we provide." The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. The suggestion that rogue elements within the American government were collaborating with foreign intelligence services added layers of complexity that transformed the counterespionage operation into a potential investigation of domestic treason. Riley's tactical awareness expanded to include this new information, assessing how it might affect the immediate situation and the broader implications for national security. "Patricia," she said quietly, "if there are Americans involved in this operation, then Petrov's team might have extraction support we haven't accounted for." As if summoned by her words, the sound of helicopter rotors became audible in the distance, but they were approaching from the wrong direction to be the American Tactical Response Team. Agent Cross immediately raised his weapon, recognizing that additional aircraft meant the situation was escalating beyond their ability to control. "Colonel." Hawthorne activated her tactical radio with practiced efficiency. "Delta Team, be advised we have unidentified aircraft approaching from the southwest. Request immediate identification and intercept capabilities." The response crackled back with urgent professionalism. "Control, Delta Leader. Unknown helicopter. Is civilian registration but flying military approach patterns. We're moving to intercept, but they'll reach your location in approximately 90 seconds. Riley's mind raced through tactical options with the speed that had made her legendary among special operations commanders. The shop's defensive positions were adequate for ground-based threats, but helicopter extraction changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Patricia, if they have air support, this isn't just an intelligence operation, it's a military extraction with significant resources behind it. We need to prevent Petrov from reaching that helicopter, or we'll lose our only direct connection to whoever's been running this operation." Dr. Chun was typing frantically on her tablet, apparently coordinating with intelligence agencies to track the helicopter's origins and intended destination. "Colonel, the aircraft is registered to a shell company with connections to defense contractors who've been under investigation for unauthorized technology transfers. This goes much deeper than we initially assessed." Petrov had been monitoring the American communications while coordinating with his own team through subtle hand signals that Riley recognized as Russian military field communication protocols. His confidence was returning as the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, suggesting his extraction plan was proceeding despite the American military response. "Colonel," he called out, "I suggest you consider the broader implications of preventing our departure. The technology transfers facilitated through Ms. Castellano's shop have been supporting American interests in regions where official military presence would create diplomatic complications. Ending this operation serves no one's interests." Riley stepped forward, her anger finally overriding the tactical caution that had governed her civilian life for 15 years. "You're wrong, Vladimir. Ending this operation serves the interests of every American veteran who's ever trusted their government to use their skills honorably. It serves the interests of everyone who believes national security shouldn't be compromised by foreign operatives trading on American patriotism." The approaching helicopter was now visible as a civilian aircraft modified for what appeared to be tactical operations. Its flight path suggested the pilot was experienced in military extraction procedures, approaching fast and low to minimize exposure to potential defensive fire. Colonel Hawthorne made the command decision that would determine whether Petrov's team escaped to continue their operations elsewhere or face justice for their exploitation of American veterans. "Delta Team, you are authorized to intercept the helicopter using non-lethal methods if possible. Rodriguez, prepare to take the ground team into custody. Riley, I need you to identify any intelligence materials they might be carrying that could compromise other operations." As the helicopter descended toward an improvised landing zone in the shop's parking area, kicking up clouds of dust and debris, Riley realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of Petrov's espionage operation, but potentially expose a network of corruption and collaboration that reached into the highest levels of American government and defense contracting. The federal agents who had started this investigation with routine paperwork were now witnessing an active military operation that would require classified debriefings and congressional oversight. The quiet auto shop in Millbrook Heights had become the focal point of an international incident that would reshape counterintelligence operations for years to come. But for Riley, the approaching resolution meant something more personal: the opportunity to reclaim her sense of honor and ensure that her skills would never again be exploited by those who viewed American veterans as expendable assets in games of international power and profit. The helicopter's rotors created a whirlwind of dust and debris as it touched down in the parking lot of Davidson's auto shop. But Vladimir Petrov never made it to his extraction point. The moment he broke cover to sprint toward the aircraft, Riley Castellano moved with a lethal precision that had made her legendary among America's most elite military units. 15 years of civilian life dissolved in an instant as muscle memory and tactical training reasserted themselves. Riley's movement was so fluid and economical that the federal agents watching barely registered her transitioned from concerned shop owner to active combatant until Petrov was face down on the asphalt. with his arm twisted behind his back in a restraint hold that would have impressed Marine Corps instructors. "Vladimir Petrov," Riley announced, her voice carrying across the chaos with calm authority. "You're under arrest for espionage, conspiracy to commit acts of terrorism, and exploiting American veterans in service of foreign intelligence operations." The 3 Russian operatives who had accompanied Petrov found themselves facing Captain Rodriguez and the arriving Delta team members, whose tactical superiority became immediately apparent. Within 60 seconds, what had been a tense international standoff became a methodical detention operation conducted with military precision. Colonel Hawthorne coordinated the scene with the efficiency of someone who had managed complex operations in hostile territories around the world. Rodriguez, secure all electronic devices and documentation. Chun, I need immediate analysis of any intelligence materials we recover. Delta team, establish a secure perimeter and prepare these detainees for transport to the nearest federal facility with appropriate security classifications. Dr. Chun was already examining materials recovered from Petrov's team, her expression growing increasingly grave as she reviewed documents that revealed the scope of their operation. "Colonel, this goes far beyond vehicle modifications. They have detailed files on over 40 American veterans across 15 states, all with specialized military backgrounds and current civilian occupations that could be exploited for technology acquisition." Riley remained kneeling beside Petrov, maintaining the restraint hold while processing the implications of Chian's discovery. 40 American veterans had been targeted for exploitation, their service records analyzed and their civilian vulnerabilities assessed by foreign intelligence operatives who viewed their patriotism as a weakness to be manipulated. How many others were deceived like I was? Riley asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. How many veterans are unknowingly supporting operations that compromise American security? Agent Cross approached cautiously, his earlier bureaucratic authority replaced by genuine respect for what he'd witnessed. "Ms. Castellano, we're going to need extensive debriefings about your interactions with these operatives and the work you performed. This investigation will likely expand into a multi-state counterintelligence operation." Agent Thornfield was documenting everything with his camera, recognizing that their routine contractor audit had become evidence in what would undoubtedly be one of the most significant counterespionage cases in recent American history. "The documentation we recovered from your shop, combined with what we're finding on these operatives, suggests a network that's been operating for years." Agent Brennan stood nearby, still processing the transformation he'd witnessed. The woman he'd initially dismissed as an unqualified small-town mechanic had just single-handedly subdued a trained foreign intelligence operative with skills that suggested military backgrounds he'd never imagined possible. The helicopter pilot, recognizing that his extraction mission had failed catastrophically, attempted to lift off and escape the scene. Delta teams. Response was immediate and decisive. A precision shot from a specialized weapon disabled the aircraft's tail rotor, forcing an emergency landing that left the pilot with no option but surrender. "That's the last of them," Colonel Hawthorne announced with satisfaction. "Rodriguez, coordinate with local law enforcement to secure the crash site. Chun, I want a complete technical analysis of that aircraft modifications, communication equipment, anything that might tell us about their broader operational capabilities." Riley finally released Petrov and stood, accepting the flex cuffs that Captain Rodriguez offered to secure the prisoner properly. As she worked, her mind was already shifting from the immediate tactical situation to the broader implications of what they'd uncovered. "Patricia," she said, using Colonel Hawthorne's first name as she had 15 years earlier when they'd worked together on classified operations. "This network of exploited veterans, we need to warn them immediately. If Petrov's team was conducting active operations, there might be others at risk right now." Dr. Chun looked up from her analysis of the recovered materials, her expression mixing professional excitement with personal concern. "Riley's right, Colonel. Some of these files indicate ongoing operations scheduled for the next several weeks. We need to move fast to prevent additional compromises." Colonel Hawthorne nodded, already formulating the multi-agency response that would be required to address the scope of what they'd discovered. "Chun, I want you to coordinate with FBI counterintelligence to establish a task force. We'll need to contact every veteran on that list and assess their situations. Riley, I'm hoping you'll consider consulting on this operation. Your insights into how these exploitation methods work could be invaluable." Riley looked around at the scene that had been her peaceful auto shop just hours earlier. Military vehicles, federal agents, detained foreign operatives, and enough classified material to fuel congressional hearings for months. Her quiet civilian life in Millbrook Heights was permanently over, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a tragedy. "I'll help however I can," she replied. "These veterans deserve to know they've been targeted, and they deserve protection from further exploitation. If my experience can prevent others from being deceived the way I was, then maybe some good can come from all of this." Agent Cross stepped forward with genuine respect evident in his demeanor. "Ms. Castellano, I owe you an apology. When we arrived here this morning, we were investigating what we thought was contractor fraud. We had no idea we were looking at someone with your background and capabilities." Riley smiled for the first time since the crisis began, an expression that combined forgiveness with hard-earned wisdom. "Agent Cross, you couldn't have known because I didn't want you to know. For 15 years, I've worked very hard to be seen as exactly what I appeared to be, a civilian mechanic who fixed cars and minded her own business. The problem was that someone else knew the truth and decided to exploit it. As the detained operatives were loaded into secure transport vehicles and the scene was systematically processed for intelligence value, Riley realized that her story had become something larger than personal vindication. The exploitation of American veterans by foreign intelligence services represented a threat to national security that extended far beyond individual cases. "What happens now?" Agent Brennan asked, his voice reflecting the confusion of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally altered by the day's events. "Colonel." Hawthorne surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully managed a complex operation under challenging circumstances. "Now we do the hard work of unraveling a network that's been operating for years, protecting the veterans who've been targeted, and ensuring that those responsible face appropriate consequences." Riley walked back toward her shop, looking at the familiar tools and equipment that had defined her civilian identity for 15 years. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter 1 that combined her military expertise with her hard-earned civilian wisdom to protect other veterans from the kind of exploitation she'd unknowingly endured. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Riley Castellano would sleep peacefully, knowing that her skills were once again serving their intended purpose, defending America and protecting those who had already sacrificed so much in service to their country. The sniper tattoo on her shoulder blade, an eagle perched on a mountain peak with crosshairs centered below, had finally achieved its true purpose. Not to mark her as a target for exploitation, but to identify her as a guardian whose watch had never really ended, even during 15 years of civilian life that had taught her the value of the peace she'd once fought to protect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.